There is a building on a hill outside almost every old city in America, and most people have never really looked at it. They drive past it on the way to somewhere else. They call it the Old State Hospital, or the Asylum, or the place their grandmother told them never to go near. It has towers. It has a central spire that rises above the tree line like the steeple of a cathedral that lost its town. Its wings stretch back in a long, staggered line, each section stepping away from the last, so that from the air the whole thing looks like a great bird with its wings half folded across the earth. It was built, they tell you, to hold the people society had decided to forget. The poor, the mad, the inconvenient. And here is the question almost no one stops to ask. Why would anyone build a palace for them? Because that is what these places are. Not warehouses. Not prisons with a coat of decorative paint. Palaces. Hand-cut stone hauled from quarries a mile away and dressed by hand. Carved cornices. Grand staircases under 40-foot ceilings. I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Gardens laid out by the same men who designed Central Park. We are told, over and over, that these buildings were simply where the treatment happened, the container that held the sick while doctors did their work inside. But what if that is exactly backwards? What if the building was not the place where the treatment happened at all? What if the building itself, the stone and the light and the towers and the long-reaching wings, was the treatment? You have to understand the story we have been handed first, because it is a good story and it is half true, and the half that is true is what makes the other half so easy to swallow. The story goes like this. In the 1800s, we did not understand mental illness, so we rounded up the people we could not explain, and we locked them away in enormous grim institutions, out of sight, out of mind. The conditions were horrific. Overcrowding, restraints, cruelty, neglect. By the middle of the 20th century, these places had become synonymous with horror, the snake pit, the madhouse on the hill. So we did the humane thing. We closed them. We tore them down. We freed the patients and we bulldozed the monuments to our own ignorance, and we moved on to a better, more modern, more merciful way of caring for the sick. Every part of that story has some truth in it. The late years really were a nightmare in many of these places. The overcrowding was real and the cruelty was real. But notice what the story does. It takes the ending, the worst decades, the collapse, and it paints the entire history of these buildings with it. It tells you the buildings were always bad, always mistakes, always monuments to cruelty, so that when they were destroyed you would feel relief instead of loss. And in doing that, it quietly erases the reason they were built in the first place. Because they were not built by people who wanted to hide the insane. They were built by people who believed, with almost religious conviction, that the right building could heal a broken mind. And they were not entirely wrong. To find where this begins, you have to go back to the 1790s, to a hospital in Paris, and a physician named Philippe Pinel. In Pinel's time, the mad were chained, literally chained to walls in filth, treated as animals or as the possessed, beaten and displayed. Pinel looked at this and did something radical. He took off the chains. He moved patients into sunlit rooms. He spoke to them. He gave them routines, work, gardens, kindness, quiet. And a startling number of them got better. Around the same time, in the north of England, a Quaker tea merchant named William Tuke was horrified by the death of a friend in a York asylum, and he built something new, a place he called the Retreat. No chains, no violence. A country house with grounds and gardens where the disturbed could walk, work, rest, and be treated as people. His patients recovered too. And the recovery was not a fantasy invented later to make the reformers look good. The early moral treatment asylums, when they were small and properly run, reported rates of recovery that would embarrass a great many institutions today. Patients arrived raving and left calm. Some left genuinely cured. The reformers became so confident that they spoke openly of the curability of insanity, the idea that madness caught early and placed into the right surroundings could be reliably reversed, the way you would set a broken bone. That confidence, That near certainty that the correct place could repair a mind is the engine that drove everything that came after. It is why they were willing to spend the way they spent. You do not build a cathedral for a problem you believe is hopeless. You build it for a problem you are certain you can solve. They called this idea moral treatment, and the word moral there does not mean what you think. It meant something closer to psychological or human. The core belief was simple and enormous. A disordered mind could be brought back to order by placing it inside an ordered, beautiful, calm environment. Not drugs, not surgery, not restraint, environment. Light, air, routine, dignity, nature, useful work, and above all a physical place designed so precisely that the place itself did the healing. The setting was the medicine. Change the container and you change the mind inside it. That was the claim. And it crossed the ocean. The man who took this idea and turned it into stone was named Thomas Story Kirkbride. He was a Philadelphia physician, a Quaker like Tuke, quiet and precise and utterly certain. In 1840 he became superintendent of the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane, and he spent the rest of his life on a single obsession, not how to treat patients, how to build the building that would treat them for him. In 1854 he published a book with a title that tells you everything: On the Construction, Organization, and General Arrangements of Hospitals for the Insane. Read that title again. It is not a book about medicine. It is a book about architecture. Kirkbride believed the architecture was the medicine, and he wrote a manual for building the cure. Kirkbride was not alone, and that matters, because it tells you this was not one eccentric's private hobby. It was official medical doctrine. In 1844, 13 men who ran asylums across the country gathered together and formed the Association of Medical Superintendents of American Institutions for the Insane. That organization still exists today under a different name. You know it now as the American Psychiatric Association. And one of the very first things this founding body of American psychiatry did was pass a formal set of propositions on how a hospital for the insane must be constructed. Not how it should be run, how it should be built. They set rules for the acreage, for the drainage, for the water supply, for the way the wards had to face the sun. They declared that no single hospital should hold more than 250 patients, because beyond that number the building could no longer work as a cure and became mere storage. The founders of American psychiatry, in other words, wrote building codes. They believed so completely that architecture was medicine that they legislated the medicine into the walls. What he designed became known as the Kirkbride Plan, and it spread across the entire United States. A central administrative core, tall and grand, with a dome or a tower, and then, reaching out from that core on either side, a series of wings, but not straight wings. Each wing section was set back at an angle from the one before it, echeloned, staggered, stepping backward as they moved away from the center. From above it looked like a shallow V, like wings, like a bird, and there was a reason for every single degree of that angle. It was not decoration, it was dosage. Think about what that staggering did. Because each wing stepped back instead of running flat, every ward at the end of every section had windows on 3 sides. Not 1, 3. Which meant sunlight poured in from morning to evening, and air moved through, cross-ventilation pulling fresh air across every room so no corridor ever went stale. The most disturbed patients were placed in the wards furthest out at the ends of the wings, the wards with the most light, the most air, and the widest views over the grounds. Kirkbride specified how tall the ceilings should be so the air had volume to move in. He specified how wide the corridors should be because he believed a cramped hallway agitated a fragile mind. He specified the heating, the plumbing, the gas lighting, decades before most private homes had any of it. He wanted every patient, including the poorest charity patient with nothing to their name, to wake up in a room filled with light and look out over trees and lawns and distance. And the grounds were not an afterthought. They were part of the prescription. Hundreds of acres, formal gardens, walking paths, orchards, and almost always a working farm. Because the doctrine said that useful work in the open air, growing food, tending animals, walking the land, was itself curative. The patients worked the farm that fed the hospital. The whole estate was designed to be a self-contained world, beautiful and productive and calm, A machine made of stone and light and green space, whose only output was supposed to be a healed human being. Kirkbride even cared about the view from the sick room window. He argued that a patient staring out at ugliness would stay sick, and a patient looking at beauty would heal. He was prescribing landscape. He was writing a scene into a window frame the way another doctor writes a dosage onto a chart. Now hold that in your mind, and let the second question rise, because this is where the official story starts to crack under its own weight. These buildings cost a fortune. Not a figure of speech, an actual, staggering, state-bankrupting fortune. And they were being built for the indigent insane, for people with no money, no power, no vote, no families who could pay, the single most disposable population in the entire society. So who convinced the government to build cathedrals for them? Part of the answer is a woman named Dorothea Dix, a reformer who spent decades travelling from state house to state house, documenting the horror of how the mad were kept in jails and cellars and cages, and demanding that states build proper Kirkbride hospitals instead. And astonishingly, they did. State after state after state committed enormous public money to raise these things. But Dix explains the will. She does not explain the how, because the how is the part that should stop you cold. Look at what they actually built with that money. Go to Weston, West Virginia, and stand in front of the building they called the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. It is the largest hand-cut stone building in North America. It is often said to be the second largest hand-cut stone building in the world, surpassed only by the Kremlin. They began it in 1858. The sandstone was quarried nearby, and every block was cut and dressed and set by hand by immigrant stonemasons, many of them German and Irish, working with hand tools. The main building runs nearly a quarter of a mile end to end. The clock tower rises over 200 feet. Construction dragged on through the Civil War, which literally split the state in two around the unfinished walls, and it was not fully completed until around 1881. More than 20 years of continuous hand labour. For a hospital for the poor and the mad. Sit with that labour for a moment, because the labour is the part we cannot reproduce and can barely even imagine. Every one of those sandstone blocks was cut from the earth, shaped, and set in place by a human being holding a hand tool. The men who did it were skilled masons, many of them immigrants carrying a craft that had been handed down through generations of apprenticeship, a craft that no longer really exists at that scale anywhere in the country. To raise that one building today by the same hand methods, if you could even assemble the workforce, would cost a sum most states would refuse to even discuss, and it would take a generation to finish. We did not just lose the buildings. We lost the entire economy that was capable of producing them. We lost the guild knowledge, the apprenticeships, the ordinary willingness to begin a project that one set of hands would never live to see completed. These places were started by men who knew for a fact that they would be dead before the final stone was laid, and they cut the stone anyway, carefully, for a stranger they would never meet. That is not a mindset our economy knows how to hold anymore. And Weston was not unique. It was the standard. Buffalo built one designed by Henry Hobson Richardson, one of the greatest architects the country produced, with 2 soaring towers, and the grounds were designed by Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux, the men who built Central Park. Danvers, in Massachusetts, raised a Gothic fortress on a hilltop so imposing that a century later it would be photographed as the very image of a haunted castle. Ohio built Athens. Michigan built Traverse City. New Jersey built Greystone. Minnesota built Fergus Falls. Dozens of them, across every state, each one a monument in stone, each one with its towers and its wings and its acres, each one raised at a cost that no modern government would ever approve for this purpose, for this population. Today, consider Traverse City in Michigan, where the superintendent ran the place on a phrase he repeated like a creed, that beauty is therapy. For years there were almost no mechanical restraints used there at all. Instead, the patients were kept busy and kept outdoors, working the farms and the gardens and the grounds, on the plain theory that useful work heals and beauty heals, and idleness is the enemy of a recovering mind. The buildings were surrounded by rare and exotic trees planted on purpose, because a patient who stopped to notice something beautiful was, they believed, a patient beginning to find their way back. This was not a prison philosophy. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. It was closer to a monastery or a grand estate built for the exact people the rest of the world had decided to throw away, and it was not the exception, it was the type. Across the whole country these institutions were run, at least in their good years, on the radical premise that the way you heal a suffering human being is to place them inside order and beauty and light and purpose, and then simply give the surroundings time to do the work. And this is the point where the people who study these buildings, the ones who spend their nights walking through them online and in person, start to ask a different kind of question. Because the official story asks us to believe that a society we consider poorer, smaller, less advanced than our own, a society without power tools, without cranes as we know them, without computers, chose to spend a generation of labour and a fortune in public money to build hand-cut stone palaces for its most powerless people. And then, within a century, a far richer and more powerful society decided it could not afford to even keep them standing. Something in that equation does not balance. And when an equation does not balance, you are allowed to ask whether you have been told the whole truth about what these buildings are and where they really came from. Look at the towers, they say. The official explanation is that the central towers were ventilation shafts drawing foul air up and out of the wards, and administrative offices and water tanks. And that is documented, and it is largely true. But stand under one and look up at the sheer scale and ornament of it, the cost of raising a tower that high in cut stone purely to move air, and ask whether a society that supposedly could barely understand madness would pour that much craft into a ventilation duct. Some go further. They look at the towers and the copper and the specific placement of these buildings on high ground near water, and they wonder aloud whether the towers were doing something we no longer understand, whether the whole structure was tuned to the atmosphere in some way we have forgotten, an instrument as much as a building. That is speculation. It is not proven. It is a question hanging in the air of a room that was, whatever else is true, unquestionably designed with obsessive intention down to the last inch. Then there is the self-sufficiency, which is real and documented and strange all the same. These were not buildings. They were self-contained worlds. Their own water systems, drawn from their own reservoirs, their own gas works to make their own light, later their own power plants generating their own electricity, their own farms, their own dairies, their own bakeries, their own laundries, their own workshops, their own cemeteries, miles of tunnels running underground connecting every part of the estate, so heat and water and people could move between buildings without ever going outside. A single one of these institutions could function completely cut off from the world around it, producing its own food, its own power, its own everything. Officially, this was practical. It kept costs down and kept the institution stable. But the people who look at the tunnels and the reservoirs and the power plants see something else. They see a design philosophy that built each of these places to be an independent, self-powering, self-sustaining organism. And they ask why. Why would you build that level of independence into a hospital for the poor? And notice where they chose to put them. Almost always the high ground, the hill above the town, the ridge with the long view, the elevated site standing near flowing water. The official reason is sound enough, that high ground drained well, caught cleaner air, and gave the patients the sweeping vista Kirkbride prescribed. But the people who collect these buildings notice how consistent the pattern is, how reliably these structures sit on the commanding point of the whole landscape, the spot a fortress or a temple would occupy, and they ask whether the placement was about drainage and views, or whether the builders were choosing these sites for reasons the record no longer bothers to explain. Here is where honesty matters, because the loudest version of this story overreaches, and you deserve the counter-argument as clearly as the claim. The mainstream explanation for all of it is coherent, and it should be taken seriously. The buildings were grand because the reformers genuinely believed grandeur and beauty healed, and because a monumental building was also a monument to the state's own compassion and pride, a way for a governor to say, "Look what we have done." The stone was hand-cut because that is simply how large buildings were built before modern methods, and cheap patient and convict-adjacent labour made it affordable in a way it never could be now. The estates were self-sufficient because they had to be, sitting isolated on hilltops far from any town's water main or power line, in an age before regional utilities existed. Every anomaly has a grounded answer, and a careful person keeps those answers on the table. The strangeness of these buildings is not proof of a hidden civilization, but the strangeness is real, and it points, at the very least, at something we genuinely have lost. Because whatever you believe about towers and tunnels, this part is not in dispute. We stopped building like this, not gradually, almost all at once, and then we did something even stranger than building them. We tore them down. The collapse of the whole idea has a documented arc, and it is its own tragedy. Moral treatment worked best when the numbers were small, when a single superintendent like Kirkbride could know every patient and the building could breathe as designed. But the states kept sending more and more people, and the political will that built the palaces did not extend to funding their operation. The wards designed for 250 held 600, then 1,000. The light and air that were the entire point were choked out by overcrowding. The farms were abandoned as too much trouble. The staff was cut. The very buildings that had been prescriptions for healing became containers for warehousing, and the beautiful theory curdled into exactly the horror the official story describes. By the 1950s, the places were overwhelmed and underfunded, and in too many cases, genuinely cruel. Then came the drugs. In the mid-1950s, a medication called chlorpromazine, sold as Thorazine, arrived, and for the first time the most severe symptoms could be chemically suppressed. A patient did not need a calm and beautiful environment to be quieted. A pill could do it. And notice what that quietly did to the entire economic argument for the buildings. If a mind could be managed by a molecule, then why pay to heat 40-foot ceilings? Why maintain a quarter-mile of hand-cut stone? Why keep the farms and the gardens and the towers? The whole expensive philosophy of environment as medicine suddenly had a cheap chemical competitor. In 1963, the federal government passed the Community Mental Health Act, promising to move patients out of the big institutions and into small community clinics. The emptying began. Over the following decades, the population of these state hospitals fell by the hundreds of thousands. The buildings emptied out. But the second half of that promise, the part where the funding was supposed to follow the patients out into a network of good community clinics, mostly never arrived. The institutions were emptied because emptying them was cheap. The community system that was supposed to catch every person let out was funded thinly, or barely, and then cut further still. So a great many of the people who walked out of those buildings did not walk into care. They walked into rooming houses, and then onto the street, and then, in staggering numbers, into jails and prisons. Today, some of the largest facilities holding the severely mentally ill anywhere in America are not hospitals at all. They are county jails. We did not replace the palace with something kinder. We replaced it with a cell and a stretch of sidewalk, and we called it freedom. The economics of that trade is the quiet horror sitting underneath the entire story. The old system was expensive, and it was at least trying to heal people. The new arrangement is also expensive, in police and courts and emergency rooms and prison beds, and it heals almost no one. We did not actually save the money. We simply stopped trying and moved the cost somewhere we would never have to look directly at it. And here is the part that should sit with you. When the patients were gone, we did not preserve these buildings. We did not turn most of them into museums or archives or monuments to a genuine and fascinating chapter of our history. We knocked them down. Danvers, the castle on the hill, was demolished and turned into apartments. Building after building met the wrecking ball or the convenient fire. The official reason, again, was money. They were too expensive to maintain, too full of asbestos, too costly to repair. But look at what that reasoning admits. We were told these buildings were built by a society too poor and primitive to know better. And then we, the richer and wiser society, stood at their feet and said we cannot afford to keep them standing. The people who could not build them are the ones who destroyed them. The stones that took a generation of hands to raise came down in an afternoon of machines, and the record of what they were came down with them. That is the thesis that this whole niche circles back to, again and again, whether it is talking about asylums or canals or cathedrals or roads. The past keeps leaving us physical objects that do not fit the story we were told about the past. Buildings that are too large, too fine, too intentional, too expensive for the people who supposedly made them and the reasons we were supposedly given. And every time, the objects are explained away one at a time, and every time, the objects are quietly removed, torn down, filled in, sold off, forgotten, until eventually the only record left is the story, and the story always says the same thing, that we, right now, are the peak, that everyone before us was smaller and cruder and knew less, that there is nothing behind us worth recovering. But stand in one of the ones that still stands. Western is still there, saved at the last moment, and you can walk it. Walk down one of those enormous corridors with the light coming through the tall windows on three sides exactly the way a Quaker doctor drew it 170 years ago, and feel what he was trying to do. He was trying to build a machine out of stone and sunlight that could take a person whose inner world had shattered and, simply by holding them inside something ordered and beautiful and calm, put the pieces back. That was not superstition. It was a genuine, coherent, and in its early years demonstrably effective theory of healing. And we did not just abandon it, we forgot we ever believed it. We forgot that human beings once looked at a broken mind and answered it with architecture. So, which is the real loss? Maybe there was no lost civilization here. Maybe there were no antenna towers and no forgotten atmospheric science, and the tunnels really were just for pipes, and the whole thing is exactly the documented, tragic, human story of a good idea that grew too big and rotted. That version is almost certainly closer to the truth, and it is worth defending against the wilder claims. But even that sober version leaves you with something enormous and lost. An entire era believed that the environment you place a suffering person into is not the backdrop to their treatment, but the substance of it. They believed it so completely that they mortgaged their states to prove it in stone. And we replaced all of it with a pill and a wrecking ball, and told ourselves we were being merciful and modern. Go and find a modern psychiatric facility. Look at it. Low ceilings, fluorescent light, no view, or a view of a parking lot. Locked, efficient, cheap, forgettable, a place designed to process people through and move them out, built by a civilization that can put a machine on Mars and has decided that where you put a broken mind does not matter at all. Then drive back out to the hill at the edge of your town, to the old building with the towers and the wings and the boarded windows, the one your grandmother told you to stay away from. Look at it again, knowing what it was. Knowing that somebody once cut every one of those stones by hand because they believed, truly believed, that the light coming through those windows onto a stranger with nothing to their name could bring that stranger back to themselves. Maybe they were wrong, but they built like they were right. And that is the thing worth staring at from the bottom of that hill. Not whether some vanished race raised the walls, but the simpler and stranger fact sitting in plain sight, that we were the ones who tore them down. That the people we call primitive answered human suffering with cathedrals, and we, with all our power, answered it with a pill and an empty lot where the cathedral used to be. The buildings that are left are the last witnesses to a belief we no longer hold. They are still standing on their hills, in the light, waiting. And the only question they are really asking is why we were so quick to stop believing that a building could heal, and so quick to bury the proof that we ever tried.